Raelith Rivermoor gazed down at the most baffling set of tracks he had ever encountered in his 3 decades of ranching. The peculiar marks stretched out across the muddy earth near his water trough, each one deeper than his boot and twice as wide. "Far too large to be a snake," he murmured, bending down to inspect the strange drag marks that seemed to interweave with massive circular indentations. However, snakes do not leave prints like these, and they certainly do not create a path that leads straight toward the rocky hills where his cattle had been behaving oddly for weeks. The morning sun cast long shadows across his property, making the enigmatic markings seem even more eerie. Raelith had tracked every creature that roamed these lands, from bears and mountain lions to the occasional elk that wandered down from the high country. Nothing he was familiar with could have made these marks. The trail was too methodical, too intentional, cutting a straight line through his pasture, as if whatever made it knew precisely where it was going. Lyria stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Your breakfast is getting cold," she called out, but her voice held a note of worry when she saw him crouched by the water trough. Over their 15 years together, she had learned to read her husband's moods, and the way he was examining the ground told her something was seriously amiss. "Come take a look at this," Raelith said, his voice tight with bewilderment. When Lyria joined him, she let out a sharp breath. The prints were unlike anything either of them had ever seen. Each indentation was perfectly round, almost as if something enormous had been rolling across their land. But the spacing between them suggested movement that was both deliberate and alive. "Perhaps it's machinery from the railroad company," Lyria suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. The nearest railroad construction was miles away, and no wagon or equipment would leave such peculiar markings. Besides, what would railroad workers be doing on their property in the middle of the night? Raelith shook his head, tracing the edge of one print with his fingers. The soil was compacted in a way that indicated immense weight, yet the pattern seemed too natural, too fluid for any machine. "Notice how they curve around the fence post," he pointed out. Whatever made these was avoiding obstacles, thinking about its path. The trail led away from their homestead, winding through the pasture toward the dense cluster of boulders where Raelith's cattle had refused to graze for the past month. His livestock had given that area a wide berth, huddling together in the far corner of the pasture as if sensing some unseen peril. "We ought to ride into town, inform Sheriff Derncliffe about this," Lyria said. But Raelith was already striding back toward the house with a determined gait. She recognized that look in his eyes, the same expression he wore when wolves threatened their livestock or when rustlers had tried to steal their horses 3 summers ago. "I'm fetching my rifle," he stated simply. "The entity, whatever it may be, traversed our property for a purpose, and I intend to uncover that purpose before it returns." As Raelith vanished into the house, neither he nor Lyria spotted the new prints that had emerged overnight close to their bedroom window. The prints near their bedroom window were smaller, but undeniably similar to those by the water trough. Raelith's hands shook as he followed the circular indentations in the soft soil beneath Lyria's flower bed. Whatever had created the trail hadn't merely passed through their land. It had been watching them as they slept. "This alters everything," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. The understanding struck him like a physical impact. This wasn't some random beast roaming their land. It had intentionally approached their house, examined their home, and possibly even observed them through the thin glass windows while they lay defenseless in their bed. Vesper clutched his arm tightly, her knuckles pale with terror. "We're departing immediately. We'll gather what we can carry and ride to town before sunset." But even as she uttered the words, they both knew that fleeing was no longer an option. The trail now led in multiple directions, toward the rocky hills surrounding their house, and alarmingly toward their corral where their horses were kept. Raelith loaded his rifle with calm hands, though his mind raced with dreadful scenarios. In 30 years of frontier living, he had confronted wolves, mountain lions, and armed men driven by desperation. But those were foes he could understand, creatures whose actions he could anticipate. This was unlike anything he had ever encountered. This was something that stalked its prey, planned its approach, and operated under rules he couldn't fathom. "If I'm not back by sunset, head to Eldoria's place," he instructed Lyria, double-checking his ammunition. "Inform him about the prince. Tell him to bring men armed with rifles and torches." The heft of his weapon was comforting in his hands, though he wondered if bullets would be sufficient against something capable of leaving such enormous tracks. The trail beyond their homestead was easier to track than he had anticipated. The creature, for lack of a better term, had made no effort to conceal its passage. It moved in straight lines when feasible, curved around obstacles when needed, and left behind a path of disturbed earth that even a child could follow. This audacity unsettled Raelith more than stealth would have. It implied something that feared no pursuit. As he tracked the enigmatic markings toward the rocky hills, Raelith observed his cattle huddled at the far end of the pasture. Their eyes were wide with a primal fear he had never witnessed before. The silence was eerie. No bird songs, no insect buzzing. Even the wind seemed hesitant to rustle the grass. The very air felt heavy with an unseen presence that made his skin prickle. The path guided him by the ancient oak where he had asked Lyria to be his wife, past the stream where they had dreamed of constructing a bigger home one day, and into a landscape that became progressively untamed and inhospitable. In this place, the prince's behavior turned more unpredictable, as if the entity driving him was becoming more animated or disturbed as it neared its goal. Raelith halted at the brink of a narrow gorge, inspecting the tracks that vanished over the jagged edge. The sun had already passed its highest point, and shadows were starting to elongate across the scenery. Beneath him, the path delved into a labyrinth of boulders and concealed caves that could hide anything. As he readied himself to venture into the gorge, a noise reached his ears that sent a chill down his spine. The unmistakable sound of something enormous shifting among the rocks below, accompanied by a rhythmic scraping that mirrored the pattern of the enigmatic trail. Raelith ventured into the gorge with his rifle at the ready. Each footfall was deliberate, avoiding loose stones that might alert whatever was lurking in the shadows below. The scraping sounds ceased the instant he started his descent, replaced by a heavy silence that felt more menacing than any noise. The trail persisted along the gorge's base, snaking between colossal boulders that formed a natural maze of hiding places. What he uncovered there shattered every theory he had about the mysterious tracks. Amidst the rocks were the remnants of a campsite. Not an animal's lair, but signs of human occupation. Torn fabric, rusted metal fragments, and the charred remains of old campfires told a tale that filled Raelith with dread. Someone had been residing in this hidden gorge, and they had been observing his family. The circular trail led directly to a rudimentary shelter built against the gorge wall, partially hidden by fallen branches and stones. Inside, Raelith discovered makeshift tools, bones from butchered animals, and most alarmingly, carved wooden wheels attached to a harness system. The device was designed to be fastened to a person's body, creating the appearance of enormous, inhuman tracks when dragged across soft earth. The realization struck him like a blow. The mysterious creature plaguing his property wasn't some unknown beast. It was a man, someone who had intentionally created the bizarre trail to sow fear and confusion. But to what end? What did this deranged individual want with his family? As Raelith scrutinized the crude workshop more closely, he found evidence that sent a shiver down his spine. Drawn on pieces of bark were detailed sketches of his home, his daily routines, and most frighteningly, portraits of Lyria rendered in unsettling detail. Someone had been watching them for weeks, possibly months, learning their habits and weaknesses. The sound of shifting rocks from above made Raelith whirl around, rifle raised. Beyond the narrow gap in the ravine, a figure stood out against the afternoon sky. Lanky, agile, and striding with the assurance of someone deeply familiar with the landscape. The man was making a beeline for the ravine's edge. Raelith's heart pounded as he grasped the grim reality. He was cornered at the bottom of a natural pit, with only one apparent exit. "I see you down there, rancher," a voice boomed from above, gritty with years of solitude and insanity. "I've been watching you follow my trail, just as I intended." "You came alone, exactly as I anticipated." The man's laughter bounced off the rocky walls, a chilling sound devoid of any humanity or reason. Raelith flattened himself against the ravine wall, attempting to stay hidden while scouting for another way out. The makeshift shelter now made sense. It wasn't merely a hideout. It was a snare, crafted to ensnare unwary victims in an inescapable situation. The enigmatic tracks, the deliberate audacity of the path, even the shadow near his bedroom window. All of it had been meticulously planned to lead him to this precise location. The voice drew nearer, more menacing. "Your wife is probably wondering where you are by now. Lyria, right? She has a habit of tending to her garden around sunset. It would be a shame to leave her alone as night falls." The threat was crystal clear, and Raelith's fear morphed into icy fury. This lunatic had been stalking his family, and now he was implying that Lyria was his next target. But as Raelith braced himself to act, he heard something that sent a shiver down his spine. The sound of multiple footsteps converging at the ravine's edge above. 3 more figures materialized at the ravine's rim, each armed with rifles and rope. Raelith's hope plummeted as he understood that this wasn't the work of a lone madman. It was a coordinated gang that had been using his land as their hunting ground. The elaborate ruse with the false trail suddenly made perfect sense. They had been driving isolated ranchers into this natural trap, likely for months. "Brought company, did you?" Raelith shouted, striving to keep his voice steady despite the terror gripping his chest. "How many other families have you done this to?" The silence that followed his question was a chilling confirmation. He wasn't their first victim, and if they succeeded today, he wouldn't be their last. The leader's voice drifted down from above, cold and calculating. "Smart man figuring out our little game?" Most folks never get past thinking they found some kind of monster. A coil of rope landed near Raelith's feet, followed by a harsh order. "Wrap that around your waist. We like our guests conscious for the conversation we're about to have." Raelith scrutinized the ravine walls desperately, hunting for any possible escape route. The rocky sides were steep, but not insurmountable, especially near the back where years of erosion had formed natural handholds. Climbing the wall would leave him out in the open, an easy mark for the 4 armed men waiting above. "Your wife is all alone right now," a voice sneered from the top, likely wondering why her courageous husband hasn't returned for dinner. "We've been observing her habits for weeks. We know precisely when she'll step out to feed your chickens." The mental torment was intentional, aimed at shattering his resolve and forcing surrender. But rather than yielding, Raelith felt his determination turn to iron. These men had desecrated everything he cherished: his property, his privacy, his family's security. Whatever transpired in the next few moments, he would not let them win easily. "You've made a critical error," Raelith shouted, retreating toward the back wall of the ravine while keeping his rifle aimed at the opening above. "My neighbor, Eldoraya, anticipates my return before nightfall. If I don't arrive, he'll search with every able-bodied man in the county." Mocking laughter bounced off the rocky walls. "That old fool. We've been handling nosy neighbors for months. It's astonishing how many ranchers simply disappear when they go investigating peculiar tracks on their land." The nonchalant confession of multiple homicides ignited a cold rage within Raelith. These weren't criminals driven by desperation. They were hunters who had exploited the solitude of frontier, living to their advantage. They had been systematically terrorizing and eliminating families across the territory, using the false trail as bait to lure victims away from safety. As the shadows grew longer in the ravine, Raelith made his choice. He would not meet his end passively in this pit, while his wife was in peril. With a silent plea, he turned and readied himself to fight his way out of the grave these killers had prepared for him. Above, rope ladders started to descend as the gang prepared to claim their prize. Raelith fired the instant the leading man's boots hit the ravine floor, the bullet striking the killer in the chest and dropping him on the spot. The resounding gunshot sent the remaining 3 gang members scrambling for cover above, giving Raelith crucial seconds to reach the back wall, where loose rocks provided potential footholds. The retaliatory gunfire came swiftly, bullets bouncing off stone and sending fragments flying like lethal shrapnel. Raelith flattened himself against the ravine wall, his mind calculating angles and distances with the icy precision of a man fighting for his life. He had roughly 6 shots left, facing 3 armed foes who held the high ground. "You should have taken the rope when we offered it," the leader bellowed from above. "Now, they would have to haul your lifeless body out of there." But Raelith discerned a new note in the man's voice: hesitation. They had anticipated quick surrender from a cornered prey, not armed defiance from someone ready to battle. Far away, Cora Rivermoor stood on her porch as the setting sun stained the sky a deep crimson, her fingers nervously wringing her apron. Raelith had vowed to return before nightfall, and the stretching shadows filled her with a chilling foreboding. Something was gravely amiss. She could sense it in the eerie stillness that had descended upon their land, in the way their horses nervously paced in the corral. A sudden resolve came over her, forged from 15 years of frontier life, and the unshakable conviction that her husband was in peril. Lyria swiftly saddled their swiftest steed and raced toward Eldoraya Holt's ranch, her hair whipping behind her as she urged the animal to its utmost speed. Whatever was transpiring in those rugged hills, Raelith would not confront it alone. Back in the gorge, Raelith had managed to scale 15 feet up the rear wall when a loose rock shifted under his foot. He tumbled backward, his palms burning as he struggled to halt his descent. Above, the outlaws were shifting, aiming to get a clear shot at his vulnerable stance on the cliff face. "There's no escape, rancher," one of them shouted. "Come down peacefully, and we'll make it swift." But Raelith had spotted their makeshift camp, the remnants of their past victims. These men didn't kill swiftly or mercifully. They relished the fear they instilled. A new sound reached his ears from beyond the ravine. The distant rumble of multiple horses galloping across the open plains. A spark of hope ignited in his chest as he recognized the chance of salvation. But the outlaws above had heard it too. Their voices held new urgency as they realized their secluded hunting ground was about to be breached. "Finish him now," the leader growled. "We've got company approaching." The next few moments would decide whether Raelith would live to see his wife again, or join the nameless victims whose remains likely lay in unmarked graves across the territory. As rifle barrels emerged over the ravine's edge, Raelith tightened his grip on his weapon and braced for the struggle of his life. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, but would aid arrive in time to spare him from the killers who had transformed his own land into a lethal snare. 3 rifle barrels were aimed at his location as the gang prepared to conclude their hunt forever. The thunderous hoofbeats belonged to Eldoria Zephyron, and 5 armed men from the neighboring ranches, rallied by Lyria, who had persuaded them that her husband was in grave danger. As they reached the hilltop overlooking the ravine, the sight below sent a shiver down their spines. 3 men with rifles positioned around the rocky entrance, clearly preparing to execute someone trapped below. "That's Raelith down there," Eldoria snarled, lifting his rifle to his shoulder. "Fan out, men." "We've stumbled upon a turkey shoot." The rescue team had timed their arrival flawlessly, finding the gang members entirely vulnerable on the open terrain above the ravine, with no means of escape. The gang's leader whirled around at the sound of the approaching riders, his expression contorting with fury as he grasped that their meticulously planned trap had been used against them. "Finish off the rancher now," he bellowed to his remaining henchmen. But his command was abruptly halted by Eldoria's rifle shot, which sent him crashing into the dirt. Down in the ravine, Raelith heard the unmistakable sounds of a rescue battle unfolding above him. Seizing the opportunity, he climbed up the rock wall with renewed vigor, his boots finding footholds that had seemed impossible just moments earlier. The surviving gang members were trapped between his rifle from below and the rescue party's guns from above. Another gang member was struck by a shot from one of the neighboring ranchers, leaving just one killer alive, huddled behind a boulder as bullets rained down from every direction. "I surrender," the man yelled, tossing his rifle away from his hiding spot. "Don't shoot. I'm giving up." But Raelith had witnessed too much evidence of their previous victims to believe any surrender from these monsters. As he finally pulled himself over the edge of the ravine, his rifle stayed fixed on the trembling killer who had helped terrorize families across the territory. The fake trail device, the sketches of his wife, the nonchalant confession of multiple murders. These men had forfeited any right to mercy. Lyria reached her husband first, throwing herself into his arms, with tears streaming down her face. The joy of seeing him alive was overwhelming, and for a moment the violence and danger of the past few hours seemed insignificant. They had found each other again, and that was all that mattered in the world. "The trail was a decoy," Raelith explained breathlessly to Eldoria and the others. "They've been using it to lure ranchers into that ravine, likely for months. There's evidence down there of other victims. The makeshift workshop, the elaborate ruse, the systematic hunting." It revealed a picture of organized malice that had been operating in their territory without anyone grasping the full extent of the danger. Eldariah stared at the surviving gang member with icy eyes. "How many families?" he demanded, his rifle never wavering from the man's chest. "How many innocent people did you slaughter with your fake monster scheme?" The killer's silence spoke volumes. As the sun finally dipped behind the rocky hills, the rescue party prepared to transport their prisoner to town, where he would face justice for crimes that had haunted the frontier community for far too long. But first, they would explore the ravine and uncover the full scope of the gang's hunting grounds. The grim findings in the concealed ravine workshop left every man there shaken to the core. Among the phony trail-making tools, they uncovered personal items from at least 7 distinct families. Wedding bands, children's playthings, and remnants of clothing all hinted at a pattern of murder sweeping through the region. A rough map etched into the stone wall detailed the locations of secluded ranches, each marked with symbols to indicate whether the families had been targeted or were still under surveillance. "The Hendersons," Eldariah murmured, spotting a unique brass button from a woman's gown. "They vanished. 6 months passed. Folks assumed they'd moved on to Oregon, but the truth was far more sinister. The Hendersons had never left the territory. They had been slain by the same gang that had nearly taken Raelith and Lyria. Tobias Crow, the local tracker, scrutinized the various paths leading away from the ravine, his horror deepening. "There are at least 3 more sites like this one," he declared gravely. "They've been active across 50 miles of territory, using different tales of mythical creatures to lure families into deadly traps." The surviving gang member finally cracked under interrogation, exposing the full extent of their operation. They had been active for over 2 years, methodically moving across the frontier and targeting isolated families with valuable livestock or land. The fake monster tracks were just one of their tactics. They had also disguised themselves as traveling preachers, injured travelers, and government land surveyors to infiltrate remote homesteads. "We never intended for it to escalate this far," the killer sobbed. But his words held no weight against the evidence of meticulous planning and execution. These weren't crimes born of desperation or passion. They were deliberate acts of evil that had terrorized an entire region while evading authorities. As the rescue party readied to depart the ravine of horrors, Raelith felt a deep sense of both relief and fury. Relief that his family had survived, that the danger was finally over, and that justice would prevail, but fury at the thought of how many innocent lives had been lost while this gang operated with impunity. Exploiting the isolation of frontier life to conceal their murders, Lyria rode beside her husband as they journeyed back toward civilization, her hand never leaving his arm. The ordeal had transformed them both in ways they were only beginning to grasp. The comforting security of their secluded ranch life had been shattered, replaced by the knowledge that evil could disguise itself in any form and strike from any direction. "We'll stop at Jedodias tonight," Raelith decided as they reached the main trail. "Tomorrow we'll head to town with this prisoner and ensure Sheriff Derncliffe learns about all the missing families." The evidence they had collected would finally provide answers to dozens of unexplained disappearances that had plagued the territory for months. The deceptive path that had initially appeared so enigmatic that morning was now revealed as a malicious trick intended to prey on people's innate fascination with the unexplained. However, in their relentless pursuit of the truth, Raelith and Lyria had unearthed something far more significant. They had dismantled a web of murderers who would never again pose a threat to any family. As they journeyed through the encroaching night, neither spouse glanced back at the ravine that had harbored evil for far too long. Weeks later, Sheriff Derncliffe addressed a crowded courtroom as the final surviving gang member was handed his death sentence. The evidence gathered from the ravine had led to the identification of 11 murder locations scattered across the territory, accounting for 37 missing individuals whose families finally received answers after months of doubt and sorrow. "Justice has been delivered," the sheriff declared to the assembly of survivors and family members. "This territory is secure once more, thanks to the bravery of Raelith Brooks and the swift actions of his wife, Lyria." The enigmatic trail that had seemed so puzzling that morning 3 weeks prior had ultimately uncovered the most extensive murder plot in the region's annals. Raelith stood at the rear of the courtroom, his arm draped around Lyria's shoulders, as they observed the killer's final judgment. The nightmares still visited occasionally, haunting visions of being ensnared in that ravine while malevolent men plotted his demise. But these visions were becoming rarer, supplanted by a deep sense of gratitude for their survival and the assurance that no other family would endure the same ordeal. The trial had laid bare the full extent of the gang's activities. They had been the architects of the baffling disappearances that had troubled isolated ranches for over 2 years, employing various ruses to lure families away from safety. The counterfeit creature tracks were merely one tactic in their repertoire of wickedness, but it had ultimately sealed their fate when they targeted the wrong family. Lyria had recounted the peculiar behavior of their livestock and the eerie silence that had descended upon their property in the weeks leading up to Raelith's discovery of the trail. Her swift decision to seek aid from Eldoria Zephyron had saved her husband's life and exposed a network of killers who might have continued their reign of terror for years undetected. "We're heading back home," Raelith said to her as they exited the courthouse together. Back to their ranch, where the mysterious trail had first emerged, but where they now recognized every shadow and comprehended every sound. The false prints had been washed away by the autumn rains, but the memory of that harrowing discovery would linger with them forever. The personal effects recovered from the various murder sites had been returned to the surviving family members, offering closure to countless individuals who had been tormented by uncertainty regarding their missing kin. The brass button that had once belonged to Mrs. Henderson's was laid to rest with dignity in the town graveyard, accompanied by various personal belongings that symbolized lives abruptly ended by mindless brutality. Eldoria Hall and the other ranchers who had taken part in the rescue were hailed as local champions. Their swift reaction and precise marksmanship had thwarted further bloodshed. The territory's law enforcement underwent a restructuring to offer enhanced safeguarding for remote homesteads, guaranteeing that such a calculated reign of terror could never again go unnoticed. As Raelith and Lyria journeyed back to their ranch, they bore the contentment of knowing that justice had prevailed and their community was secure. The path that had appeared too vast to be forged by any serpent had guided them through the darkest phase of their existence. Yet it had also unveiled their own bravery and the depth of their love for one another. The enigma was unraveled, the culprits were vanquished, and life on the frontier could proceed with the assurance that comes from confronting malevolence and triumphing over it. If this story touched you, give it a like and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in their shoes? Subscribe to Frontier Stories and join us as we continue to tell stories of hope, resilience, and the beautiful, messy truth of Wild West.